I'm really humbled by Wayne's introduction, and in fact, I'm humbled by the opportunity to come and talk to you about Canada's Species at Risk Act, or SARA, my friend Sarah, who's having a birthday this year. And this is a topic, talking about SARA is something that I've, as Wayne mentioned, become comfortable with through my experience on COSEWIC, on the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada. And I wanted to start this evening by saying that while virtually all of what I'm going to say tonight stems from my involvement with that committee, as I stand before you, I'm just speaking as an individual. I'm not actually representing the committee at all. Though I suspect I'm not actually saying anything that would be disagreeable to the committee either. But I'm simply speaking as a scientist with relevant experience with SARA. I think this presentation is timely for a few reasons. For one, as I just mentioned, Sarah's about to have a big birthday. She is turning 10. And her birthday, she was proclaimed December 12th, 2002. I'm going to stop calling her she because that's going to get annoying really fast. But it's also timely because Sarah makes its way into the news on a fairly regular basis. So just a few stories that have appeared over the last 6 months. This is a COSEWIC press release that comes out every time we meet, talking about grizzly bear and about threats to habitat and how important those threats are for the species that we list. Here's another story quite recently about the prospect that bluefin tuna could be added to the list and some of the impacts that might have. Here's a story puzzling over the delays in processing the emergency assessment that COSEWIC did for 3 bat species. We use emergency assessments only when our process is too slow to deal with a threat that comes on really quickly for a species. And with these particular bats, these 3 bats have well-documented dramatic declines due to white nose syndrome, a disease that's made its way into Canada very recently. We assess them quickly so that they could be dealt with quickly, but we're wondering what's happening with that now. And here's a story about actually recent legal action that's been initiated, asking how it is that we can approve a pipeline project when in fact species at risk are known to be along the route of that pipeline, and we don't have recovery plans yet for those species. Here's a story from the summer that we'll return to a bit later about decisions not to list particular species. And a good news story, I think, mostly about the recent release of a recovery strategy for the woodland caribou, which was long in coming. Now here's a story that caught the attention of many biologists, including myself. This is extracted from the Globe and Mail in this case. And it's a story in which the Minister of the Environment, Peter Kent, mentions that we need to do something about SARA, and stating that SARA could use some improvement. And this story is particularly timely because, well, in fact, we've been looking at how SARA is doing, me and several groups of colleagues. And so I thought this would be a good time to inform you about how SARA is doing so that you might be informed when we hear about these proposed changes, whatever they may be. So this is what I want to do tonight. I want to basically divide my talk into 3 parts. I want to give you a SARA 101, so just a quick overview of how the law is structured to protect species at risk. And then I'll spend most of my time in that middle part talking about what I'm calling the SARA sieve, the places where species get caught in the SARA process, where they don't necessarily make it from one step through the next. And then I want to close by talking a little bit about SARA's future and whether or not changes are in fact needed at this time. So as I mentioned, it's Sarah's birthday, and so we should all write Sarah a birthday card. And I mentioned already that the Act received royal assent in 2002, and many of the provisions of SARA didn't come into force for another year, close to another year, until sometime in 2003. So most of the first listings under SARA, for example, are dated 2003. So what does this act do? Well, the preamble to the act tells us what the act is supposed to do. The purposes of this enactment are to prevent Canadian Indigenous species of wildlife from becoming extirpated or extinct. An extirpated species no longer occurs in Canada. An extinct species no longer occurs anywhere. To provide for the recovery of endangered or threatened species and to encourage the management of other species so that we can prevent them from becoming at risk. That all seems quite laudable and eminently clear. This is what the SARA process looks like. So we can divide the process pretty tidily into 4 steps, where we begin by assessing the status of candidate species. So we ask the question, is this species under threat, and at what level? So we could decide, for example, that a species is endangered, threatened, of special concern, so not quite threatened yet. It could be extinct or extirpated. It could also be data deficient, where we simply lack the information to assess status. And finally, it could be not at risk. We could actually go through the whole process and go, you know what, this one's actually fine. We assess status separately in Canada from making a listing decision, and we'll talk a little bit about why that might be, or why that might be a good or a bad thing. The listing decisions and the rest of the SARA process are guided or are conducted by the government. That first step, the assessing of status, is conducted by the committee that I serve on, by COSEWIC. So within the government, listing decisions are made, and the government has to ask, based on this assessment that we've received, should we list this species? And at this point, there could be consultation with stakeholders, there could be socioeconomic analysis. In fact, there always has to be a little bit of a socioeconomic analysis at that stage for very bureaucratic reasons, because listing a species is a regulatory change. All regulatory changes in Canada get a regulatory impact assessment. So if a species makes it through listing, then it moves on to the third stage, where we go into recovery planning. And I should mention here that recovery planning is a stage that happens for only certain risk categories, for extirpated, endangered, or threatened species. There are other processes for special concern species. And once species are extinct, we don't do anything for them. Or to them anymore. And then finally, after the recovery planning stage, we move on to action planning. And the difference between these two can be a little bit subtle, but in recovery planning, we ask, what do we need to do to recover this species? What are our goals for recovering this species? And then in the action planning stage, we get to the nitty-gritty. We say, what steps, what studies, what precise measures are we going to take? So that's your SARA 101. Except for a few extra little bits here that I should add. So under SARA, I mentioned COSEWIC already. COSEWIC is the scientific committee that prioritizes and assesses the status of wildlife. And it has been doing this since 1978. So COSEWIC is older than SARA. They've been at work for a long time. Their decisions end up being recommendations to the government. SARA normally applies only on federal land. This is an important distinction, for example, with the U.S. Endangered Species Act. And it also applies to aquatic species and to migratory birds because of the Migratory Bird Convention and because all water is under federal jurisdiction. It's important to note that 41% of Canada's land area is federal, but that's not evenly distributed. Only about 4% of the land base in the 10 provinces is actually federal. And in fact, in BC, we only have about 1% federal land. That's mostly parks, so national parks, airports, and First Nations land. There's military facilities. Even within this context, even within that small portion of federal land, SARA really only offers protection on what's designated as critical habitat for a species. So it doesn't just have to be on federal land, it has to be in a little parcel of land that's been designated critical to the survival and recovery of that species. Another distinction from the US process, we don't have a delisting process in SARA. We just keep assessing, and eventually, hopefully, things get better and we decide that something is no longer at risk. So I want to get into the major chunk of the talk here where I talk about the SARA Civ. And I've laid out for you here some of the basic statistics for this sieve. So at the present time, we have 653 species that have been assessed by COSEWIC as at risk. There's also 15 extinct species. Again, those are no longer considered at risk. Of these 653, 551 species have made it through to the listing stage. So not all the species that are assessed as at risk make it through to listing. And of those 551, 384 need recovery strategies. So if you remember, the only species that require recovery strategies are those that are endangered, threatened, or extirpated. Okay? So 384 need recovery plans, 146 have them as of right now. And that's about 38% of the ones that need them. Only 6%, only 6 species actually have action plans as of right now. And so given that the first possible date that a species could have been required to have an action plan was 2006 because of little delays or timelines that are built into SARA, that means that we're averaging about 1 action plan per year. So given that to date we have 384 species that are making their way through the process, it should take us about 381 years to complete the action plans that are due now. So that's a problem with the sieve, right? There's a plumbing issue there. So what I want to do next is break down the stages in this process and talk a little bit about what some of the factors are that might result in you not making it through to the next stage. So we start at the top with the COSEWIC process. COSEWIC is the coolest committee that I could ever hope to work on. It's a group of 50 people who sit around a table and argue and discuss and argue details, go back over details, look at graphs together, develop process, work hard all day, and then leave it all behind at the end of the day and have a good time together. So it's an expert volunteer panel. It includes professional biologists from multiple sectors, from government. So there are people from every province and every territory on COSEWIC. There are representatives of government agencies. There are Aboriginal committee members, and there are taxonomic experts. The panel includes 31 votes. It's just the way that it's structured. We've got the 13 jurisdictions, the provinces and territories, the 11 specialist subcommittees, where we get 1 vote for every 2 people, 3 non-government scientists, 4 federal agencies, Department of Fisheries and Oceans, Parks Canada, Canadian Museum of Nature, and the Canadian Wildlife Service. And we're all supported by a professional staff, the COSEWIC Secretariat, who are employees of Environment Canada. Our panel also includes at least 1 really good photographer who manages to do this for us all the time. Once a year, this is our most recent meeting in Kananaskis. So COSEWIC has an incredibly rigorous process, and you really can't appreciate this until you're stuck in the middle of it. The committee prioritizes species for assessment. We oversee the reports on species, we conduct the assessments, and we report our findings publicly to you, and we also communicate them to the government via the Minister of the Environment. Currently, we produce about 15 to 20 reports for new species every year. About 60% of the reports that we're processing every year are reassessments that we have to do every 10 years. And so we're getting to that 10-year timeline. The status reports are our key products. You can go and see all of the status reports. They're all online and publicly available. They're science-based. They're subject to 3 rounds of review by all the biologists on the committee, by additional biologists in the provincial and federal governments, by agency biologists, and in some cases by professional biologists as well. We evaluate the species that we look at using international criteria. So we follow IUCN criteria, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, and we assess into these risk categories. Importantly, COSEWIC is independent and science-driven. So even though there are representatives, for example, of fisheries and oceans, when they walk into the room, they don't work for fisheries and oceans anymore. They're biologists. They're there to do the job of assessing the species before them. And we're science-driven in the sense that we don't think about the downstream consequences. If someone gets the inkling that this or that species might be difficult to list, that comment is never made at the table. We focus on the data that are in front of us, and we assess the species strictly based on biological criteria. So here's an example of a species that we've assessed. If you've been to the museum, you'll have seen one of these. So we've assessed blue whale, both separately Pacific and Atlantic populations. And as you probably know, blue whales are the largest mammals, the largest animals, in fact, ever to have lived on Earth. Blue whales were assessed as endangered by COSEWIC in 2002 and reaffirmed in 2010. And they're also listed as endangered on SARA. So the key threats to this species are ship strikes, noise, entanglement, and climate change. And I'm going to use this sort of slide layout for a bunch of the examples that I use in the talk. And the little box at the bottom tells you why in particular I'm bringing up this species. What I wanted to note for this species is that we assess this species as endangered using the A criterion and the D criterion. And this is just to give you an example of the type of criteria that we use. So to assess something as endangered, the population has to be declining at a rather alarming rate, has to have lost greater than 50% of the total population, that's the total number of individuals, over 3 generations. So for blue whale, that's about 32 times 3, so about 96 years. We estimate, or we infer in that case, that the population has declined, in the case of blue whales, by more than 70%. So again, this is a difference with the US Endangered Species Act. They don't follow these criteria, and so sometimes when our decisions are poorly understood, it's because of a lack of understanding of the bar that we set for pushing a species into a category. So these are the 5 types of criteria, either decline in the total population, or a small distribution and a decline, or a small and declining number of what we call mature individuals, the reproductive individuals in the population, or under criterion D, a very, usually very, very small or restricted population. And then the E criterion, the one we hardly ever use because we hardly ever have that information, is based on a quantitative analysis that makes a specific projection of decline. And believe it or not, we also have criteria for extinct, extirpated, and special concern. So this is how COSEWIC is doing. So since 1978, when the first species were assessed, those were just birds and mammals initially. COSEWIC has been chugging along at a fairly constant pace, despite adding additional taxonomic groups. So we now assess mammals, birds, amphibians and reptiles, fishes, both marine and freshwater, invertebrates, and plants, including vascular plants and mosses and lichens separately. And yes, I know that lichens aren't actually plants. Okay, so that's essentially the assessment process. Let's talk a little bit about the listing process. So not everything makes it through this sieve, and this is one of the consequences of the Act that was first noticed. And this has also been studied in some detail by different groups of researchers. And so we can point here to a couple of different studies by Arna Moores at Simon Fraser and his colleagues, and by Scott Finlay at the University of Ottawa. And they show that there are, in fact, biases in what species get listed. So marine fishes are rarely listed. Nunavut species are rarely listed. Species under the jurisdiction of the Department of Fisheries and Oceans are rarely listed, or they're far less likely to be listed. Species that are subject to any kind of harvest, commercial, recreational, or aboriginal, are also rarely listed. And so this might lead you to ask that question that's at the top, is why do we do this? Why does the government do listing? I actually like this aspect of the process because as a biologist, as a committee of biologists, we're not accountable to the taxpayers, we're not accountable to the voters. We want to do our work based on the biological features of the organisms that we're interested in, and we want to be able to communicate that to you openly and immediately. So we tell you what we decide based on the biology in front of us, and then the government does the messy bit of deciding whether it's worth it to list a particular species and what the factors are, the various socioeconomic, political factors that might go into that decision. We as biologists would rather not think about that, and at the same time, we would rather be able to communicate directly to you without that layer of filtering, I guess. So there are biases in the listing, and given what I just told you, you can probably understand why those particular effects exist in terms of which sorts of species have trouble making it through to listing. The other feature of listing, though, is that listing decisions are slow, and they're especially slow for species that end up not being listed. We can ask a little bit about why that is. We really don't fully understand that, but we can hazard a few guesses. I will mention, though, that there are some species that have been waiting for a listing decision since 2005. And you have to wonder what kind of process needs to take that long. So here's our poster child for listing decision. This is Atlantic cod. And the data that I'm showing you here are for the Newfoundland and Labrador populations. We have the ability in Canada to easily consider units below the species level, where that makes most sense from the biology. And so Atlantic cod has been assessed as 6 distinct units. And in 2003, COSEWIC assessed the Newfoundland and Labrador populations as endangered. In 2006, the government decided not to list Atlantic cod. In 2010, COSEWIC reassessed it, concluded that it is still endangered. And the main threats to cod are probably no surprise to you, primarily overfishing, and in the current situation, predation is probably also a significant threat. But if you look at the graph of what the population of cod in this area has looked like over time, you can see that the decline is really quite dramatic. In fact, this is the greatest loss of biomass to vertebrate species that we know of, 97 to 99% decline, but listing is still too costly. And I use the expression too costly there not at all as a slight. There are real costs to listing. There are direct economic impacts to listing decisions. There are also non-economic consequences to communities that associate their identity with fishing cod. And so we may or may not agree with that particular decision, but there you have it. There's certainly no arguing with the fact that this species is still in trouble. Okay, so the next step in the process that I want to talk about is recovery. And as I start to talk about this aspect, I want to mention my teammates, many who are here in the audience. So last September, in September of 2011, we gathered together a group of 14 interested individuals, including graduate students and postdocs and other researchers at Simon Fraser and UBC, and we conducted an analysis of the 146 recovery strategies that had been finalized up to that point. And as you can see, it was quite a sacrifice for these guys to make it indoors for that amount of time, but we did it. And so what I want to present to you now are some of the key findings. And I sat there this weekend and wondered just how many bar graphs it was sensible to present after 7 o'clock in the evening, and I decided about 146 was the right number. Yeah? Okay. You can count. Let me know how I'm doing. So these are the species that need recovery strategies, and you can see the total here in any given year and the way that that's progressed. I think the lack of listings in 2004 and 2008 kind of pops out, but I don't think it's particularly interesting the calendar year, after all, begins and ends on arbitrary days. So those are the species that we expect to have recovery strategies. And so that's the set that we're interested in. So in that 12-week period over which we looked at these recovery strategies, we read and analyzed SARA to become familiar with the provisions, especially the parts that relate to recovery. We developed a set of traits that we were interested in scoring for those recovery strategies. And we scored, we rescored, we reassessed, and we rescored a large set of traits. The data matrix is quite cumbersome. And our goal with this data set is to provide feedback on how this phase of SARA is proceeding. And so our plan for that communication is things like this, as well as peer-reviewed journal articles and communications to government. So the traits that we scored included a whole variety of species trait. What taxonomic group are they in? Are they marine? Are they terrestrial? Where are they distributed? How many provinces do they occur in? Are they subject to exploitation? How were they assessed? What got them in trouble to begin with? Various timeline features. When were they assessed? When were they listed? How long did it take to get a recovery strategy? Who was responsible for that? And then various other aspects about threats that I won't really talk about tonight, the number and type of threats that are affecting species as reported in recovery strategies. And then finally, this bottom panel, this bottom bullet, which is really important. Recovery strategies are required under SARA to set objectives for population and distribution. And so we wanted to look at what targets are being set for recovery in order to help us understand what it is that the government means when they use the term recovery. Maybe there's a clue in those goals. So this is the sort of course summary of progress. You can see that based on the years on the x-axis, recovery strategies are becoming due. And in fact, a whole bunch of them became due in 2006 because that was the timeline set by the first set of species that were listed under SARA. And you can also see from there that our progress in finalizing these strategies has not been particularly great up until the last few years when we're actually producing more recovery strategies than we're accumulating species. So we're making progress on the backlog, and you can see that here, that the total number of recovery strategies that are still due is coming down as we move forward. So that's a positive sign. We looked for biases, the way that there are biases in the listing of species. We looked for similar kinds of biases in which species are getting recovery strategies, and surprisingly, we didn't find very many. So there's no taxonomic bias that we can detect. If you're a bird, if you're a plant, you're equally likely to have your recovery strategy be complete. You're not that likely to have it complete, but at least equally likely. One of the interesting things that pops out, though, is that range edge species, species that just make it into southern Canada, are more likely to be getting their recovery strategies finalized. And honestly, I don't have a clue what that means, but there's the pattern. So species that are widespread in Canada, for which we have the primary responsibility, are actually less likely to be getting their recovery strategies finalized. I don't consider that to be a particularly good sign. So I've mentioned this to you already, that SARA normally applies only on federal lands, and that in particular it applies only in areas that are designated as critical habitat. So we wanted to ask, how are we doing on designating critical habitat? So let me tell you a bit more about what critical habitat is. It's under SARA, it's defined as the habitat necessary for survival or recovery of a listed wildlife species, and that's identified as the species critical habitat in the recovery strategy or in an action plan. So we're going to talk about action plans later. Right now we're talking about recovery strategies. SARA says that you have to try to define critical habitat early, at the recovery planning stage. You shouldn't wait to the action plan phase unless you completely can't do it, don't have the information. And so we can ask whether or not that's happening. If in fact critical habitat is not fully described, you still have to do your best in a recovery strategy, and then you can add more detail to that at the action planning stage. What SARA further says is that the critical habitat of endangered, threatened, or extirpated species, if it's designated for those species, shall not be destroyed. And that applies to all of the critical habitat of aquatic species and birds, and to the critical habitat of other species that's on federal land. So critical habitat doesn't have to be on federal land, but SARA only protects the critical habitat that's on federal land. So here's how we're doing. So initially, we were not doing very well at defining critical habitat in recovery strategies. So you can see that the orange part of those bars is really tiny relative to the parts of the bars that designate species for which critical habitat is not identified in a recovery strategy, and we're doing better at that. So you might think that this is a sign of government learning or of government good behavior. Unfortunately, you have to know that in 2009 there was litigation that was resolved that made the point that critical habitat has to be identified, and the courts actually told the government that they were shirking their responsibility. And so that good behavior has come about through the use of a big stick. So here's an example of critical habitat designation, or a story about critical habitat designation that relates to the burrowing owl. So in blue, in that range map, you can see the historic breeding range of burrowing owl that included parts of BC and parts of Manitoba, in addition to parts of Saskatchewan and Alberta. Currently, burrowing owls only breed in Canada, in Alberta, and Saskatchewan. This species was assessed really early in 1978, in that very first COSEWIC year. And it was assessed initially as threatened and then moved to endangered in 1995, and that was supported again in 2006. This is a SARA-listed species. It came onto the list when SARA was enacted. The main threats are loss of habitat, conversion of habitat to agricultural lands, and loss of burrows. The recovery strategy that was proposed in 2007 didn't include any critical habitat designation. It was not possible in 2007 to designate critical habitat. We simply didn't know enough. Interestingly, by the time the recovery strategy was finalized this year, all of a sudden it is possible to designate critical habitat for this species. We can ask about what might have changed over that time span. Maybe there's a ton more knowledge about this species. I suspect it's actually the litigation that's pushed this into place. But in fact, we shouldn't be thrilled yet about that designation, because the critical habitat that's been designated for this species is entirely in Grasslands National Park, and so it would have been protected anyhow. In fact, there's no critical habitat for this species in Manitoba or British Columbia. So I mentioned to you that population and distribution objectives are a key part of recovery strategies. So we wanted to figure out if we could actually put some kind of a scale onto those objectives. And we worked pretty hard at this, and we came up with an ambition score. And our ambition score starts from the lowest possible ambition, where you don't set an objective, to the highest possible ambition, where you say, you know what, we're going to restore this species to historic levels. And with everything in between there. And so what we did was to go through all of the recovery strategies, look at the wording that was used in setting these objectives, and assign them into these categories. Now, these kinds of objectives are set on 3 different axes. They're set for the number of individuals, for the number of populations, and for the area covered by the species, each of them separately. So the average ambition score is 2.17 out of 4, and that's just slightly above the bar 2, which is maintain the current levels. So this is averaged over those 3 categories: number of individuals, number of populations, or area. And so our goal, our overall average goal for recovering species, is to take them just on average a little bit better than where they are currently. And we're no more ambitious, we're not significantly more ambitious with any taxonomic group. There are actually very few recovery strategies for some of these taxonomic groups. None of those differences is actually significant. So one of the things that we thought might be at play here is that, in fact, not all species became endangered in the same way. If species, in fact, have never had a big range in Canada, maybe their goals aren't going to be very ambitious. Maybe keeping them where they are now is the best that we're going to do. But you'd think that for species like cod, if cod were listed, that have suffered a dramatic decline, that we might actually set a goal that says, let's pick it back up. So these are species listed under the A criterion. The A criterion requires that we have lost at least 50% of the individuals over the last 3 generations. And look at what we see. We see that for the number of individuals in blue, the most common stated goal is to maintain the current number of individuals. I don't think that's recovery. We do see some more ambitious targets being set for some species, but by and large, we're not very ambitious, even for these steeply declining species. We can come back and talk about our blue whale. This is a good news story. So blue whales, as I mentioned before, have lost over the last 3 generations about 70% of their total population in Canada. And in fact, this is one of the species with the highest ambition score. This species has an ambition score averaging over 3, in which we intend to restore to not quite historic levels, but higher than current levels, both the number of individuals and the area over which we find the species. This is the real winner, though. This is the, I have to look at the spelling before I mispronounce it. This is the prothonotary warbler. This is a species that's just stunningly beautiful, that occurs in Canada only in southern Ontario, like many of our SARA-listed species. And it has a perfect ambition score. It has the highest possible ambition score, a score of 4, where we're aiming to restore historic levels of individuals, populations, and area. And so we can feel good about this, except I will caution that this species' historic level is about 40 pairs in southern Ontario, in about 5 locations. And so while it's hard to make an argument for going above that, getting back to that level will hardly assure the long-term persistence of this species in Canada. We looked for a signal of a trend in ambition scores over time, and I first have to point you to the fact that this scale is altered and expanded a little bit. So we're just looking at scores here between 1.95 and 2.30. So they're not very large in terms of their difference on a scale of 1 to 4, but the only significant signal that we can find when we look for a trend in ambition scores is that it's declining over time. So we're not getting more ambitious as we're producing more recovery strategies. We're getting less ambitious, if anything. So where this takes us is to ask the question, what does recovery mean? A layperson's definition of recovery is getting back to a normal state of health or mind or strength, back from the brink, back to being just the way you were before the crisis happened. The Government of Canada definition appears to be long-term persistence, or where the decline is arrested or reversed. And that word "or" is the troublemaker in there. Because if I tell my children that you can do 15 or 20 minutes of practice, they're going to do 15. And I think most of us are like that. If we get told to do, 2 hours of exercise at minimum a week, that's pretty much where most of us go. Maybe not all of us. A more reasonable definition, a conservation-informed decision, could vary. We might not all sit down and agree on what a definition of recovery is, but here are some of the options that are out there. So for starters, something more than long-term persistence. Because long-term persistence implies that you get to hang on by a thread forever. A return to self-sustaining might be nice, where we don't have to have so many inputs for you to actually stay the way you are. An alternative and more sort of operational definition would be downlisting, or listing, or switching your listing category to a lower category, so going from endangered to threatened, or from threatened to special concern. Wherever we arrive, we do hope that we arrive at something better than what we're seeing in operation. I put the polar bear up here just to remind myself that, in fact, in talking about recovery planning, we've set aside a whole set of species that are special concern. Polar bear was assessed as special concern and listed under SARA in 2011. And it's noteworthy for a few reasons. One of them is that it's among the only species where the key threat is climate change, or where one of the key threats is climate change, in addition to levels of harvest. Polar bear is special concern, so it's not going to get a recovery strategy, it's going to get a management plan. And so that management plan is aimed at keeping this species from getting worse, from becoming threatened or endangered. And at this point, there's no analysis that I know of those particular plans. So I want to talk really briefly about action plans. It's hard to say anything about action plans because there's just 6 of them. And as a scientist, I like data. And 6 is still at the level of almost an anecdote. These are the 6 lucky species that have made it through to the action planning stage, where we have clear plans for how we're going to get them to their recovery goals. I think there are 3 plants, all with very small ranges in Canada. There's the Banff spring snail, an endemic species to Canada that occurs only in Banff National Park. So one could argue that it was pretty well protected to begin with. There's the red crossbill, that again has quite a small range in Canada, in Newfoundland. And then there's the northern abalone, which I think is the most interesting species that to date has an action plan. So abalone, northern abalone is a species of our coast. It's been listed as threatened since 2003 and then reclassified as endangered in 2009, so it's not doing particularly well. There is an action plan for this species, and that action plan focuses on halting or deterring the illegal harvest that continues to threaten the species, and on research to help enhance the probability that populations will recruit new juveniles. I say that this is the most interesting species because it's the one species in there that actually has a broad range, a fairly broad range in Canada, and that has some threats that require clear, widespread action. So this is what we concluded, or what we can conclude at this point about the SARA Civ. Species assessment, I think, is working quite well. Listing decisions are made slowly and with certain biases. The development of recovery strategies was initially slow, and it is speeding up. And recovery plans increasingly include designation of critical habitat. All of those are, I think, positive signs for recovery strategies. But to date, the recovery goals are modest, and they may not provide, in fact, for species recovery. With only 6 action plans completed to date, all that we can say is that we're way behind on these. And in fact, these are the documents that we need to guide recovery of species. So I want to return for a moment to think about SARA's future, because the minister has stated that there are improvements to be made and that sooner rather than later we need to address changes to the Species at Risk Act to be more effective. So we should think about what those changes might be. And in fact, the broad reaction of the biological and environmental community is that if the government reopens SARA, there's a good chance that it will get worse and not better for species at risk. Why do we think that? Well, we think, for one thing, that it's actually not the law that's flawed. And I hope that I've provided you some insight into this. It's the lack of vigor that's been applied to its implementation. There are no structural problems that I've shown you here in the way that SARA is designed. What we see in terms of ineffectiveness or inefficiency is that this sieve is acting to hold species back from receiving the full protection under SARA. Here's a plant that indicates a particular type of concern that one might have about SARA's future. This is coast manroot, and I tell you to be cautious before you put that into a Google image search. It's a large climbing perennial. It's in the cucumber family, which you might guess. There are the fruits up at the top. It has a very large woody storage root, and that's what's responsible for the common name, nothing else. It was assessed in 2009 as endangered by COSEWIC, and in 2012, just this past summer, the minister decided not to list this species. The threats are habitat loss, trampling, and invasive species. Coast manroot is known from really just 3 sites in Canada. Apparently there's a new discovery, so there may actually be 4. But it's all kind of moot from the perspective of SARA because the decision was made not to list it. What was in that decision? This is the order that was published that explains the decision. And the order says a few things. It says coast manroot was never common in British Columbia. It's never really here. It's at the northern edge of its range. It's only known to occur on land other than federal land. So these might provide, given the timing of this decision, it might provide some hints about what the minister has in mind for SARA. So maybe range-edge species are not where we want to focus our attention, and maybe we don't want to focus our attention on species that don't actually occur on federal land. Oh, and by the way, in case you're worried about the coast manroot, really don't be worried because it occurs in the Garryoak ecosystem, and that's a priority. And in fact, the Habitat Stewardship Program allocates $9 to $13 million a year to protecting species and their habitats. So I guess it doesn't matter if it's not listed. And maybe that's true. You know, a sampling of biologists might tell you that range-edge species are important, or they might tell you that range-edge species are maybe not the priority for listing. So these species have maybe less than 1% of their global distribution in Canada. They just eke in across the border. And in fact, these are just our plants that are listed under SARA. Most of our plants are range-edge species. They just eke into Canada, and that's even more true for British Columbia. Most of our SARA-listed plants just eke in across the border. So maybe none of this needs to be protected. Maybe we don't need to worry about this type of species at all. Maybe that's the kind of change we're going to see to SARA if the minister reopens the Act. Here are a few issues I might point out with that kind of logic. First of all, the map on the left shows you the distribution of species at risk in different ecozones in Canada. And you can see the darker colors are all along the southern edge. And so our greatest diversity of species at risk is along the southern edge. If you look at the panel on the right, you'll see human population density across those same ecozones. And you can see that, lo and behold, we are also a range-edge species. Most of us live quite close to the border, and most of the threats to species that we see, and we've looked at this through our analysis, are in fact very localized threats. It's our direct actions that are putting species at risk. And in fact, this third map shows you essentially a composite score that's been developed for the risk to species in those same ecozones. And it shows you again that those southern ecozones are particularly at risk through the combination of high impacts from humans and from having rare ecotypes, rare ecosystems, and species with limited distributions. So that's just one tale about a caution in the approach that the minister might choose to take to altering SARA. So we could ask more broadly whether SARA is working, and one measure of that might be that a couple of hundred species have been assessed in the last 10 years, and most of the species deemed at risk by COSEWIC are in fact making it onto the SARA list. It's important to note, though, that the SARA sieve, the slowness in the process, is not reflective of limitations with the legislation, but it rather reflects incomplete and ineffective implementation. Having said all that, really the big question is, are species better off on the ground? Are the species that are listed under SARA actually doing better now than they were before they were listed? And that's really the crux of the matter, and that's actually the most challenging question to address. We might say, well, it's only been 10 years. Recovery strategies have only been appearing for 6 years. We still only have 6 action plans. How can species actually be doing better? But in fact, it is important to think about the fact that not all of SARA's actions are actually achieved through direct implementation of SARA. When a species is assessed as endangered by COSEWIC, little flags go up all over the place. Flags go up with biologists that occur who are working in the provinces, who are working in the territories, and actions get taken in response to those kinds of decisions. Listing decisions essentially up the ante, because in that case the jurisdictions become immediately aware that these species are going to require attention at some point in the future. I also have to say that just the fact that a species gets considered for listing or gets considered for assessment means that somebody's already been watching it and is already maybe worried about its fate. And so we can think of SARA's success as measured strictly by how much better species are doing before versus after, but that's a little too simplistic. We should also think about the broader message that a legislation like SARA communicates and the effects that that has for species stewardship. The other aspect that I don't want you to forget, or that I want to highlight, is that SARA as a legislation puts into place a process. And a part of that process has actually been played out through the analysis that we've done on recovery strategies. The fact that we can look and see what those recovery strategies contain is a direct byproduct of the fact that there is a law that requires that those recovery strategies be produced. So we know more about the species that are at risk because of SARA. They were at risk regardless of the legislation, but we call more attention to them because of the legislation. So what should we do next? Well, here's my letter. So this is my letter to the Prime Minister. It says, Dear Prime Minister, if you want to improve the fate of species at risk, please do the following. Improve SARA's effectiveness by fully using the tools in the Act to protect species at risk. Speed up listing decisions, recovery planning, and action planning. Conduct independent and comprehensive socioeconomic impact assessment for listing decisions. This is something that I didn't talk about, but that I'd be happy to address questions about later. Allow recovery strategies to be purely scientific, making decisions about government priorities transparent at this stage as they are at listing. So separating out the biology from the political trade-offs and decisions and difficult decisions that have to be made as we do at the stage of assessment and listing. And for that matter, you could establish a COSEWIC-like body to help with that, because if you put a bunch of biologists into a room, they will generate a lot of work. Use the provisions for emergency listings, stewardship agreements, and other safety nets, all SARA provisions that I can't tell you about today because they really haven't been implemented and they have not been put into place, they haven't been used. And so we don't know how effective those provisions might be if they were helping. The other part of the letter is to tell the Prime Minister what not to do. Don't change the independence of species assessment. Don't allow appointments to these kinds of working groups to become politicized. Don't politicize the species that can be assessed by a scientific independent body. Don't use the claims of ineffectiveness as a reason to reopen and weaken SARA. And don't trade the fate of our biodiversity for short or medium-term benefits. And I'll close with that. Thanks for your attention.